Great to be here with you all. Before we get into things, I just wanted to start off with a question for the group here. You had it spoiled a little bit when we saw the presenter view, but when it comes to quality, what's your number one priority there? Any participation from the audience? Anyone? Can give you some examples there, maybe. What about automating further? It's a big one. Being more data-driven with your teams, reducing bugs in production, or even fostering team collaboration. These are all big things in this year in particular, and only are going to become more and more important. And so, what we're going to cover today is a lot around observability, about how it can really be a key enabler for our teams, as well as for our app's quality. With that, we're also going to talk about intelligent test data, and how we can move beyond just collecting data and having access to it, into gaining real insight from that. And lastly, we'll be talking about turning these insights into real outcomes. We'll touch on where you can see the benefits and ultimately the impact that you'll have on your teams. And so, what do we mean when we talk about observability? It's not just necessarily having the data, it's also about making sure that you have the data when you actually need it, and also making sure that it's relevant to you, so it can help enable those initiatives that we touched on at the beginning. And really, these are the four things that I just talked to you earlier about: automating further, being more data-driven, to more familiar ones as well, like reducing bugs in production and team collaboration. And so, for a lot of these, observability is really a key enabler. But really, how can we get to the state where we can actually observe and actually gain insight that can change all of these and help achieve these for us? On one side, you may have an automated process today. You may have something you're just keeping your head above water. It's very hard to actually see where you're at just because of the amount of time you spend on testing. On the other side, you may have something that's automated, but you may have silos, especially today. If you're not fully adopting DevOps, you may have completely different solutions within your team, within developers, to QA, let alone between other teams, and it's hard to really make changes with that when you really don't have a core strategy that runs through your entire team and your entire operation. And so where does that ultimately leave us? The first thing that I wanted to touch on comes from Gartner. This is really about building intelligence, and one of the places that we see this being most impactful is functional testing, UI testing. This is what mabl specializes in today. It's also about having a strategy in place that helps enable these. And so with intelligence solutions today, you see a lot of things about resiliency and ease of use. mabl, as an example, enables a low-code solution for people to get up to speed very quickly on testing, create these resilient tests, and build out test coverage. And there's a lot of other solutions that do the same here. But on the other side of that, when it's easy to build out test coverage, when it's easy to really have your tests running where you need them, whether that's locally with your developers on their local builds, within your pipelines and in production, you get a lot of data from this. And these solutions also provide a great potential to aggregate this data and present it in an insightful way. And so on top of the benefits that we see with customers reducing their failure rates pretty considerably, between manual solutions where you're spending so much time just actually running the test, to automated solutions where even then testing still ends up being a bottleneck, you still have tests, there's this middle ground there. And so let's dive into what we really can move from data into insight. And starting with that, well, what kind of data are we talking about? I think these are four large categories that are pretty important to this. The first is functional. And the first two here you may be pretty familiar with already. This is everything passing. You have velocity. You're looking at the velocity of how quickly you can solve issues, how quickly you actually are enacting change. And then there are two that are a bit more subjective and a little bit harder to define. Coverage, what's being tested? Are we actually expanding coverage into the areas that our users are actually using? And lastly, and one I'm particularly passionate about, is non-functional. Diving into things, especially in UI testing, especially in the legal market that we have now with a lot of lawsuits. performance, accessibility, these are becoming more and more important today, especially if you're in a more regulated industry, or I think most of us come from countries as well, or operate in countries where there are laws and real impact from those. And so, this is really one of the first things we're probably all tracking here. There's a lot of ways to easily get this into Jira. You may have this in Jira or in your test case management tools already. And so these are things like test pass rate, number of tests run, flakiness, and the frequency and severity of bugs. And these are pretty easy to measure, but with something like an intelligent tool, when you have insight, or well, you have basically the ability to aggregate a lot of this, these tools can do a lot of that heavy lifting for you. You may have a solution that does a lot of this today, but these solutions can make these a lot easier. They can look across your runs on a specific version and identify flakiness. They can see when you've actually, when you have a build and you're running a test against it, they can see not only you may have code coverage and linting running against your code, but you can also see the actual percentage of the tests that you're running against that. And so, one of the things that one of our customers is tracking actually is, and really seeing, you can see here the impact of changes that they've made just based on the data that they're actually populating. And again, you may probably have already access to this today, and looking at in January, there's clearly something happening there, and now this team can say, well, in February we actually enacted a new process, a new system, and we really saw change in how our tests are operated and the value that we're getting out of this tool. The other one is velocity that I mentioned. And so there's a lot of other things here that may be more traditionally tracked outside of testing tools. One very basic one you may be using for your developers is the time spent per issue or test. Another one you can look at, which is pretty easy with a lot of test case management tools, is actually the number of tests that you've automated. This is something that when people try out our tool, this is one of the major success metrics as well. There's a lot of other tool-specific metrics that you can get here, and one of the more interesting areas that we see a lot, especially with companies that are really trying to get their teams spun up on testing, they're trying to roll out DevOps and really quantify how successful that is team involvement and performance. And again, from that earlier customer data I showed you, this is one of the ones where the team actually purchased the tool in September. They're trying to roll it out with developers, and you can see someone maybe took some time off in January, but that's going up and to the right and is showing the success of their efforts there. Another way we can do this is tracking test coverage, and this one is really critical, as I'll show you in a little bit, but it's looking at key workflows and leveraging real user data there. I think that's one of the really important things here. And so the things that you can look for when you're actually testing is your core user journeys that are tested. This is something that you want to have data backed up by real user data. Internally, we're actually using Segment for a lot of this data. It's great to get that data exactly lined up with what our tool is actually testing. And there's also a lot of other data that you can get from here, particularly your teams may be using Google Analytics, maybe someone outside of your team. You already have a lot of access to this data, most likely, perhaps somewhere else in your organization. And so these are things like different browsers and UI testing, mobile devices versus desktop, specific versions of browsers, as well as different scenarios and different locations. And part of this is also the continuous validation of this, because as you're changing your product, your surface area changes pretty dramatically. And so there's a lot of new things that pop up here. And with another customer, you can see that over time, they've started with mabl in Chrome and Firefox, and they've started to roll out a strategy to start testing in Safari as well. And there are many, many ways to look at this. Just browsers is a very easy one. But again, you can look at different languages. If you're expanding in new markets, you want to make sure and validate that you're actually covering that. And the last one here is non-functional. This is about going beyond the pass and fail and testing the user experiences that are outside of your core functional testing. And this is really where a lot of these intelligent tools actually do pretty well. And so the things to look for here, and the things that are actually pretty easy to track, because they're ultimately not too different than tracking bugs, for example, is process against your accessibility guidelines. The main one in a lot of countries is WCAG 2.0 AA, It's a tremendously long acronym, but it's pretty critical. In the United States, that's codified in Section 508. In a lot of other countries, the UK, Australia, Japan, and most of the EU also have these. With that also now, thanks to Google's core Web Vitals, if you are actually someone who has a customer-facing website or testing something similar, now has an impact on SEO, and with that, performance as well. So these tools can actually generate a lot of this data that will populate the performance history as well, and use this to track your progress there. So one of the things that we do is we'll identify the different violations, and we focus on the critical ones for accessibility, and we include that like we do bugs in our Jira, and we can burn those down and work through those. Another one that's a little more different, and there's definitely a bunch of different tools in this space, is actually visual changes. And so these are things that may not break your testing today, but ultimately are still perhaps breaking to your experience and the experience that you want to have. And these, again, with a lot of these tools, can be escalated just as easily through Jira into tickets, just like you have normal functional bugs today. One of the ways, and one of the booths actually out here right now, that you can track a lot of this is with Jira Insights. And so things like bugs, accessibility issues that I mentioned are easily tracked manually here. Jira Insights is really a great place to start. That gives you insight into your average level. This one in particular is looking a lot at what I mentioned as velocity. So you have information on your deployments, you have information on how frequently you're actually making changes. And so if you get feedback, for example, that your bugs in production are going up pretty substantially, you may actually want to check these charts and say, okay, our deployment frequency, is that actually going down a little bit? Are we successful in slowing things down, or is there some divide between the engineering side, the QA side, if they're a little bit more siloed and divided as well? Another one that I mentioned earlier is the cycle time. How much time are we spending on each of these? And ideally, as you're rolling out these tools, maybe there's a little bit of a learning where that changes, but you ultimately want to see that go down, and you want to see your deployments go up and be more, just be faster and more resilient. And so where do we ultimately see the benefits in all of this? I think this is really one of the most sort of exciting parts of this. And again, we're probably familiar with the first two here, but we still have a long way to go ultimately for a lot of this. A survey from GitLab a year ago says that only 12% of teams claim to have full test automation. There's a lot to go in the functional side and the velocity side to get up to speed into a more DevOps process. These intelligent tools reduce test creation pretty substantially and reduce test maintenance as well, as we found in our customers, and also our competitors are finding the same thing. And what that ultimately results in is these two are deeply related. If you can't actually see if your tests are passing, if things are working properly, then your velocity is probably going to suffer as well. You can see on the prior page, actually, we talked about deployments, and there'd probably be a tremendous increase as well, as we've seen with customers, with up to a 300% increase in production deployments. Now that they actually are able to create the test faster, but more importantly, also have insight into what is actually happening there. And that really plays into confidence. And these two are a little bit tougher. These are sort of more of the soft skills of test automation, you'd say, far, far more subjective. And so these are coverage and non-functional. We'll start with coverage here. This is one of the metrics that really surprised me, is that 80% of teams with high test coverage also reported high customer happiness. And just for question for the audience here, what do we think the number is for teams with high test coverage that reported low customer happiness? Anyone? Feel free to shout it out. 50%? 40? It's actually 3%. It is pretty remarkable how much an impact coverage has, just ultimately on your end users, as well as how your team operates and your process as a whole. And to dive a little bit deeper in that, this is from that same survey that we had. it begins to make a lot of sense when you see what's on the right there. Maybe a little bit difficult to understand at first, but what it's basically saying is that when you have non-existent to only really good test coverage that you don't have full confidence in, you still aren't able to react as quickly as when you have absolutely excellent test coverage. And the core of this is when you can actually observe what your test coverage is. You can match it up to where your users are. You don't actually have to say, we've probably heard this, it's like, okay, the tests are passing, but let me just check these 8 things. And what this is looking at specifically is the less than 8 hours is just in one working day. Are we able to react within one working day and solve that? And when you don't have that confidence, you don't have complete confidence, things bubble over. You have meetings to review it. Internally we have our own Elmer Fudd sessions where people are doing bug hunts if you're a Warner Brothers fan and testing things out. That adds more times. You have to recheck things again, and you're just not ultimately able to respond as quickly, and that has a tremendous impact on your customer experience. There are a lot of companies that are competing today solely on customer experience, especially larger companies that have similar offerings. Your competitors are moving quickly, just as quickly as you are, perhaps faster, perhaps with better quality. And so a great place to start here is trying to understand test coverage, and so you can have a real impact on that. Another one that's really critical here, and what I'm particularly passionate about, is the impact of non-functional testing. What's really important here is that non-functional aspects can often be as severe as functional failures. And so one metric from Google is that every 1 second that your page takes to load, visiting from a search engine, you lose 10% of your visitors. And so that's pretty substantial as you go up. Imagine you have an experience that visit a news website, it takes 10 seconds to load. Are you going to stick around for that experience? Probably not. You're probably going to jump, go to another website that loads more quickly. You've lost confidence in the next page. Is the next page going to be faster? Is the next page going to be even slower? I don't actually want to find out what that next experience is. And so that's why actually performance, as well as accessibility now, starting in November for mobile and now last month for desktop, that data is actually included in Google search rankings. And what Google is looking for there is to make sure that you're not going to bounce. And I think we can agree that that's a good experience. We ultimately want websites that are loading faster, that are more performant, to be the first ones that load up. It's a similar experience here for accessibility. If I'm someone with a disability and I have to use a screen reader, by the way, there are 15% of the world population, about 1 billion people, have some form of disability. And so if I go to this news website, even if it loads quickly and I can't tab through, I can't access this website. I have to go someplace else. And so whether that situation is someone who's differently abled and can't actually use the website because of accessibility issues, or that's someone who's just visiting the website for the first time and it doesn't load before they actually leave, neither of those are actually functional experiences. They're broken for the users, and they'll, as Google shows us, they'll bounce pretty quickly. And so you'll lose the majority of your users very, very quickly, and that's why Google is actually prioritizing that. The next one is about access for everyone. It's in many, many countries now. It's the law. It's becoming stricter as well. There are new guidelines. There are a couple of countries that are, again, this acronym is quite long, WCAG 2.0A. There's far more countries now that are AA, and we're looking at AAA as well. The amount of lawsuits since in 2017, I think, has risen somewhere around 400%. It's a massive, massive amount now. You can be sued multiple times as well. So if you have a web experience, you can be sued once. If you have a non-functional, non-accessible mobile experience, you can be sued again. And so this is not only an experience that, I mean, we talked a little bit about the non-functional earlier, how it's not working. You're obviously going to lose revenue. But it's also about you're going to lose face. You're not going to serve your customers well. You have a real impact as well, the potential from lawsuits. There's a lot of companies that are in the news now, notable or infamous for losing these lawsuits. With that, it's also just the right thing to do. There's 15% of the world's population has some form of disability. It's 1 billion people. It's an absolutely massive number that are ultimately impacted with this. And lastly, I want to talk about it's more than just a goal. It's ultimately good design. A survey from PwC tells us that 75% of consumers consider UX to be one of the most important factors in their decision. It's really, truly critical. But with that, imagine you're going to a website. You're going to the same news website. It loads quickly. You can use it, and you have flashing elements on the page. The contrast is terrible. Are you going to actually want to use that page? No, it's bad design. It doesn't hold up to modern UX standards as well, and you're going to have degraded experience as well. It doesn't just mean consumer as well. There's a lot of data that tells us that most employees are unhappy with their internal tooling. It's inaccessible, it's hard to use, it's slow. It's just not great design because people are ultimately thinking about the end users rather than their users internally that are actually using that product day to day. And so, just want to go over some of the key takeaways from this. It's that observability is still a challenge for many teams. You may have a manual process where you're just not focused on observability today. You may have a process that's very automated, but it's really difficult to actually understand what that process is doing. You may have silos in engineering. They may be using tools that are only run locally, and you only get this basic pass-fail data out of that. And that ultimately is helpful to understand whether we can move to the next step. But it also just doesn't work great for confidence if we only have that data. I can't look back my team and say, well, this sprint, we had this number of accessibility issues that we didn't resolve, and so how does that impact the next phase? Intelligent automation and a lot of this data that's being collected and surfaced insightfully in many, many different ways with different tools also helps enable deep insight into things. When I have an understanding of the actual deployment trends over time, and that can be piped into Jira, and I can see my team's progress, I know what to focus on. I could see perhaps that my team isn't ready for the level of speed that we're at right now. I could see that our deployments are going up and our severe issues are rising accordingly. And lastly, we talked about how confident teams are high impact teams. They're able to react more quickly. They know exactly that their test coverage is actually covering the user experiences that their users care about, the user experiences that their users actually use. And with that, they're also able to respond more quickly because they're not waiting for things that aren't relevant to them. If you're a customer and you feel like cross-browser testing is a big thing, we need to do it across all browsers, and you spend 50% of your time testing IE because it's IE and it's hard to test, then maybe you should be really looking at your data and saying, is that worth that tremendous investment? Another one is really mobile as well. And so thank you so much for joining.